Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to be with you today for this installment of Tuesday Race Talks. I cannot overstate how excited I am to have this dynamic trio with us. This group has been working with students and faculty at the Stanford Law School on some projects which they initiated to address educational inequity in New York City and then hopefully potentially nationwide. So let me just introduce the panelists first of all, and then we'll hear more about the work that they're doing. First off, we have Annette Naranjo Pilco, who is an Ecuadorian community legal worker, a healer, and a philosopher. She's been a social activist for years. She is a co-founding director of the Peer Defense Project of IntegrateNYC, and she has been an avid organizer in NYC and elsewhere to try to advance racial justice and equity in the context of education. She is currently a student at Macaulay Honors College at the John Jay campus in New York City and is majoring in Latin American studies with a minor in philosophy. She focuses throughout her work on using restorative justice and transformative justice frameworks to create healing. We also are pleased to have Sarah Medina Camiscoli, who is the founder and co-chair of IntegrateNYC. Sarah founded IntegrateNYC when she was an ESL teacher in the South Bronx. In 2018, while continuing her involvement with IntegrateNYC, she became a student at Yale Law School, where she has studied civil rights, youth advocacy, racial justice, and movement lawyering. Sarah, we don't hold it against you that you were in law school on the East Coast rather than the West Coast, because we understand that you needed to be close to IntegrateNYC. She will graduate this May and will begin her work as a social catalyst, as a Justice Catalyst Fellow. She's also an instructor, while a law student, an instructor at Yale College in the Education Studies program. And lastly, but not least, we're delighted to have with us Mark Rosenbaum, who is a longtime civil rights litigator. He's currently the director of Public Counsel's Opportunity Under Law project, which aims to eliminate economic injustice. For those of you who are unaware, Public Counsel is the largest, some would say most prominent, most effective, perhaps, public interest law firm in the nation. Mark has argued 4 times before the United States Supreme Court, more than 24 times before the 9th and the 6th Circuit Federal Courts of Appeal, and also before the California Supreme Court and the United States Court of Military Appeals. He has been the principal counsel in landmark cases in the area of education, specifically with regard to K-12 education, but also he's worked on cases involving voting rights, poverty law and homelessness, and discrimination on the basis of sex and race and sexual orientation, among other cases. This is a group who has brought together their extraordinary and different talents to really become a formidable force in the fight for educational equity, especially with respect to race. So let me start with you, Mark, and maybe we could start with the lawsuit, since you are counsel of record in the lawsuit. And this is litigation that was covered widely in the media, in the New York Times and elsewhere. But for those who are unaware of this recently filed landmark litigation in partnership with IntegrateNYC, could you start by just giving us a sense of the aims of the litigation and the problems it seeks to address?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having all of us here this afternoon. It's a privilege to speak to this group. And as you intimated, Rick, we have worked really closely with you and others in the law school and the education school, doing really important work to further the goals of the litigation. The lawsuit that we are working with IntegrateNYC and the Sidley Austin law firm and Dean Kamaker and Dean Minow is the first case brought in the United States to seek to establish a state constitutional right to an anti-racist education. The specific purposes are that every student should go to a school and be part of a public education system that has as its paramount goal the identification and the dismantling of racism, both outside the school and within the school system itself. And our goal here is to make certain that public education, which is supposed to be the great equalizer, is not the great unequalizer, and that it does not create, perpetuate, and justify the existence of a racist hierarchy, a caste system. Those are the overall goals of this litigation.
Rick, I can't hear you right now. Is that my own tech issue?
No, that's mine. I'm sorry. I was hoping I would make it through this day and not hear. Rick, you're on mute. Rick, you're on mute. I almost did it. But so now that we've gotten that out of the way, Sarah, let me bring you in because you are the co-founder, or maybe you're the founder, but you are the founder of Integrated NYC. Could you give us some background on Integrated NYC? What are the problems you're focused on? How did you address those problems? What motivated you to found the organization?
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about founding Integrate NYC as a 501c3 and an organization, but then I'll probably pass it over to Annette, who is my co-founding director of the Peer Defense Project, which is a particular project and legal arm that has worked on this litigation. And so from a movement lawyering perspective. And so I can just give a little bit of background. In 2014, I was an ESL teacher in District 7 of the South Bronx, the only Puerto Rican and Spanish speaking educator in a building that predominantly served Black and Puerto Rican students. And when I was teaching ESL, a majority of my students would constantly ask me, why am I in ESL if I speak English? And it struck me that we were not having a conversation about integration and segregation and racial inequity that included the experiences of the students who were hardest hit, and that there were siloed conversations between resource inequity, enrollment access, decriminalization, as if they didn't fall upon the same bodies. Mm-hmm. And so I really appreciate the way Annette has talked about Integrate often is bringing a holistic approach to racial injustice from the vantage point of students who are experiencing that compounded racialized trauma. And so over the course of the first 5 years, Integrate built out the 5R platform on real integration that started with students doing school exchanges and having conversations. And Annette was one of the first students when she was a junior in high school to call this into question. Is it possible to actually have good and bad schools in a system predicated upon white supremacy and racial hierarchy? And her response was no. And so we created a framework that could both honor the assets of certain communities and acknowledge the multiple impacts of racism. And that framework included barriers to enrollment, separating and sorting mechanisms, everything from standardized test scores to GPAs to things like interviews. We then looked at resource equity, whether we're talking about lunch access, vermin in the building, accessibility with things like elevators, whether we're talking about teacher representation, who's teaching curriculum, what are teachers teaching, and what are the opportunities to create relationships, and then decriminalization. The idea that these issues are being addressed in silos and that integration was being spoken about as if moving bodies was in and of itself sufficient was a huge problem. And that really came from students, particularly students of color in segregated schools and students of color who are minority isolated in predominantly white institutions like Annette, who could really speak to the various experiences. And so we worked with several different, or a whole advisory group of nonprofits between 2017 and 2018 to create the School Diversity Advisory Group recommendations. They were brought in the frame of the 5 hours of real integration. Our students took beautiful photographs at a press conference and nothing was implemented. In fact, once COVID hit, there was enormous divestment. And so we've really seen the importance of legal tools as ways of supporting that movement and elevating and honoring that movement. And so I'd love if Annette, if you want to share a little bit, because while I founded Integrate, the legal project only exists because since Annette was in high school, she's been saying, what about immigration issues? What about issues of criminalization? What about racial discrimination? How can we use legal tools for that? So Annette, I'd love if you want to share a little bit about why this project is special and why you wanted to have a particular project work on a legal vantage point.
Thank you, Sarah. What you said about law being a tool and us using it as a tool is like, what is the answer as to like, why? Like Sarah said, we have worked on like multiple working groups as a youth-led organization with other like youths, working with the DOE, with city council members, and like what we talked about was just never implemented, right? And in all our meetings, I also want to add like, we hold youth councils like every month, and in those meetings we have students from all boroughs coming into like our monthly meetings and saying like, this is what we want to see in our schools, or like, this is what's messed up about our schools, this is what needs to change, this is what I like about my school, like an all around, like Sarah said, holistic framework of it. So it was crazy to see that like you're not paying attention to a body of students that is composed like from students of all the boroughs of New York City. And I think like we really saw the Peer Defense Project as an opportunity to use law as a tool and like get into those conversations as well, and exist in the advocacy side, and then also exist in like the law space, saying like, what are things that we can move to make like things for our organizers easier, and things that our students have been advocating for and organizing for years, like make that actual like have it be implemented within the system. And I think like the Peer Defense Project is a legal projects because there's a lot of like maneuvering within that system, and that's how we see like us providing support.
That's great. Annette, can you tell me more about what the Peer Defense Project does? I mean, how do they? That's the legal side of Integrated NYC. Can you tell me more about what they do or what you do in that role?
Yeah, so a lot of our work has been focused on the lawsuit of declaring, right, that New York City is running an anti-racist education, or they're running a racist education, sorry, the words got mixed up, right? Like, which is like a huge thing for us because advocates and organizers have been saying that for forever, right? Like we exist in a racist, in a racist system, and like the things that our teachers are saying to us are racist, the curriculum is racist, but that's never been acknowledged in the law. And so I think it's that we're like having it be acknowledged within the systems itself, like there is language for it, and this is actually what students are going through. So we have 3 projects that we're working on with the Peer Defense Project. We also work around youth voting rights and having conversations around like what it would look like to lower the voting age. What does it look like? What power structures exist right now, and how does it block youth from getting into power positions and being able to make decisions for themselves about themselves. We also work around youth abolition and talk about like what it would mean to abolish like any carceral system for young people, and like what does actually holding your community look like.
And to Annette's point too, in terms of the tools that we're building in those areas, those have been 3 movements where our student organizers who've been impacted by racism in education have been interested. We really work on youth-centered impact litigation, looking at youth drafted model legislation and youth design know your rights technology. And so this work with Public Counsel is really our main focus around our youth-centered litigation, engaging youth community legal workers at almost every stage in the process. And so everything from outreach to conversations is engaged in an intergenerational process.
Okay, and how do you, I want to talk more about that, but how did Integrate NYC and Public Counsel come together? How did that partnership form? Mark.
First of all, I neglected to mention one other attorney, Ben Crump, who is working on any number of cases, including the murder of Mr. Floyd, who's also one of the chief counsel in this case. It's a really important question. And, I think when we think of movement lawyering, often we talk the talk, but we don't really commit ourselves to what movement lawyering is about. I know when I was in law school and when I continue to teach in law school, we teach the notion of civil rights actions that involve community groups. But so often what that really means is go out and look for a plaintiff, go out and look for community groups that can serve lawyers' purposes by being props in cases. We do, as you mentioned earlier, Rick, equal educational opportunity cases all over the country. We were successful in cases establishing a right of access to literacy in federal court in Detroit and in California. But we hadn't really engaged in cases that went to the root causes of unequal education. I mean, my God, we're 67 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And as Sean Reardon at Stanford has pointed out, there's not a single major educational system in this country with primarily Black and brown kids that is anywhere near achieving the potentialities of those young people. And so David Kirkland, who is Vice Dean of Equity and Race at NYU, and whom we'd worked very closely with in the Detroit case, said, you should come to New York and you should talk with those groups who, as Annette and Sarah have said, have made genuine integration their mission. And the first group that he mentioned was Integrate NYC. So we contacted them, the lawyers that I've mentioned, we contacted them. And the first person we spoke with was Sarah. And Sarah said to us, look, this is what we do. We're interested in thinking about the litigation, but we want to be partners and real partners in this process, because that's what movement lawyering is about, where the communities themselves, and in this case, a student-led organization, establish the agenda. The best civil rights cases, really the only authentic civil rights cases, work backwards. And they think about what would really be necessary, say here, to achieve genuine educational opportunity, and what would be necessary to get at the root causes. And what Sarah and her team said to us is, we are eager to work with you, but the lawsuit is not the engine. It is the political movement that is the engine, and let's see how the lawsuit can serve us. And we want to be part and parcel of every decision. And it struck us that for all the years of work on equal educational opportunity, and I'm very proud of the work we've done, we nonetheless had never gone to the source. We had never figured out why the schools were as disparate in their treatment of children and students as they were. We had never asked the most basic sorts of questions, nor had we asked the question as to what purpose unequal schools were serving. And it was really in conversation with Integrate NYC and the student groups, the conversations that Annette was talking about, that those themes became clear. Look, every case, every great case is defined not by the law, but by the themes that underlie that litigation and the movements it supports. And what we found in listening, and that's after all where policy comes from, and it's after all where litigation theories come from, and it's where the cases themselves come from. What we heard was that the inferior opportunities that were being afforded Black and brown children throughout the United States, most particularly in New York City, one of the most, if not the most segregated school system in the United States, wasn't accidental. It was the absolute consequence of racist policies that attempted to degrade Black and Latinx kids and attempted to disenfranchise and subordinate them from the political systems, so that what we think of as the basic purpose of education, to let one better their circumstances and become a meaningful participant in the political process. What Integrate taught us was that, look, this was being denied not by coincidence, but because that was the intent of the system itself. And so that's where the partnership became, and it became a process of close to a year, wouldn't you say, Sarah? Close to a year of working and listening, and then developing the sort of facts that Annette was talking about, to say that it's not about treating education just as an equalizer, but it is to make certain that it doesn't function as an unequalizer to create and perpetuate a caste system. And we don't move. We are joined at the hip in terms of this case and in terms of our personal relationships in making this happen.
Wow. So there's a lot there. So there are two themes that I want to pick up on. You talked about this is not a case where you go out and find a partner who just sort of gives you the case and then you take the case, and the lawsuit is sort of the engine of the case. But you think of this more as a lawsuit that's actually supporting the movement that pre-existed the lawsuit, and whose themes the lawsuit seeks to amplify so that they can become reality. So what's the strategy? How is it that you hope, let me take it back to Sarah. How is it that you hope for the themes of the work? How is it that you hope to transform from the movement into the reality of change in the New York schools? What are the mechanisms of change there that you're looking to?
Sure. So I think that let's talk about specifically from the vantage point of the movement, because I think that the movement, in terms of its relationship to schools, and then the organizers and activists within it, are really sort of the frame. And so I first just want to give credit to and suggest that everyone connect with and support the Movement Law Lab, which is an incredible resource and training, and trained and developed many of our students and me through some of their virtual courses. And the Movement Law Lab talks about movement lawyering as distinct from traditional forms of what we consider either community lawyering or poverty lawyering or public interest lawyering, wherever it may be, in three ways. One, it's about shifting the autonomy of the individuals and the impacted leaders of that movement and the impacted people. And so first of all, part of this lawsuit, or part of our work here, has been making sure that we're doing Know Your Rights trainings and really supporting our young people and our plaintiffs to fully understand every single stage of the process. That in and of itself, if you're doing effective ethical communication with clients, they should be fully briefed and understanding what is going on so they can actually lead the work. And so we've been making tools and Know Your Rights training so that our young people can fully understand that. And so the first piece about autonomy. Additionally, you see that something we always have to work on is the legal profession, as we all know, is wrought with racism and classism and elitism and colorism. And that means that Annette and I have to work in partnership with Mark and talk constantly about the ways in which each of us are either exacerbating or supporting the allyship and inequities in our leadership. How do we debrief constantly? We talk every single week about new processes for how to elevate voices of young people. And that has been an amazing critical eye, and really thinking about, I didn't hear that voice in that conversation. Or if you noticed when we made that decision, young people gave their consent, but I wanted to hear more, and were people properly informed? She's constantly thinking about that. And in my opinion, pushing the attorneys on the case to a very deep, deep, deep realization of professional ethics around responding to clients and youth clients. And so that's one piece, is the autonomy. The next is the institutional power. So just within the organization, we have youth legal workers from the community legal worker model, which I want to say Amanda Alexander from the Detroit Justice Project has modeled out the community legal worker model. We've taken that model and we now are working with young people. Annette is serving as a community legal worker on this case. And so we've created this concept, which is really at the intersection profession of what's historically known as legal assistant or paralegal, an organizer, an advocate, and supported young people to be in that practice and done the deep research to understand what is authorized practice of law, what is unauthorized practice of law, what is ample supervision. That takes some extra time. And in the movement, in my mind, all of our students are hoping to be involved in the legal profession in some way or another, because we're creating meaningful opportunities that honor and support and create power. In terms of material resources and that third prong of movement lawyering, it's really looking at what is accountability going to look like. When you see in the complaint, you see the demand for relief is both declaratory and injunctive. We are asking for action, and we are asking for a declaration of a right, of an affirmative right, and we're asking for accountability metrics and systems to put in place, acknowledging that racism does not get solved because an individual in and of itself institutes a policy that is successful in a settlement that will get easily consumed by the water that we swim in. And so that's really the difference of movement lawyering. And also just having the suit be a part of a long journey, not seeing the suit as the culmination of everything, but as a new opportunity for us to continue to grow our work and continue to support our work, because the lawsuit in and of itself to us is only as meaningful as both that declaratory and injunctive relief is felt by the young people. Declaratory relief, what does it mean if it doesn't fall upon ears or eyes or minds that can understand it? What does injunctive relief mean to anyone if you can't necessarily experience that change? And so our job is that relief is fully realized, and that relief in of itself was designed by the leaders and the organizers and the youth advocates in the movement.
Wow, that's great. Let me pick up on that and then go to you because you became involved with Integrate NYC while you yourself were in high school. Could you tell us, what was that experience like? How did you become involved with Integrate NYC, and what was the experience like for you as a young student?
Yeah, so I became involved at Integrate NYC through a school exchange. I went to a predominantly white school in Brooklyn in New York City, and I just never felt safe in my school. I never felt comfortable, and I didn't even know that feeling safe in your school was something that was possible. I just always felt uncomfortable. I was in my Hispanos Unidos club. It was it was the only club I joined in my school, and it was because my Spanish teacher pushed me so much to join it, because she knew that was a community space for the Latinx students there. And she really did do a lot of the work. She's the one who taught me about my history. She's the one why I'm comfortable in my background and my identity, because she also did that extra work and that took that extra love and poured it into her students so that they knew where they come from, and they knew their history. And it wasn't only that we were getting taught the white history, right, or a white European history, because that was the only history that was in our curriculum. So through that club, there was a coalition formed in our school. Also, it was mostly the cultural clubs called Respect for All, in efforts to build a respecting space, a space where students are able to respect each other in our school. And the first thing that we talked about was school segregation, which none of us knew about. I think it was our teachers who brought it to our attention. And I think that's really important, because students day to day, we're living that experience, yet we're not giving the lens to look at it from a bigger picture and saying this is happening to students all over the city. And my experience is not supposed to be like this. So when we started talking about school segregation and how all of the system that exists right now it's working the way it's supposed to be, because the system wanted students segregated, right? And they wanted Black and Brown students to get less resources, and they wanted them to get less of everything, while white students got the most resources and most of everything. And so through that coalition, we started learning more about it, and we came across Sarah and her class, who I think it was actually called an Integrate NYC for Me class. So we took out the for me part somewhere down the road. But it was, yeah.
Was that a class just at your school, or was that a class for students from all different schools?
No, that was a class in Sarah's room, in Sarah's school.
Okay.
Yeah, and I believe it was an elective, so people weren't even really required to take that class. But that's how we got in contact with each other. Before we had the actual exchange, we had like various Skype calls with each other. There's like the students themselves, we would be like there would be Skype calls set up, and we would talk to each other about our experiences. And they were really good conversations to have. They were also really hard conversations to have because we were living different experiences, and we had to like realize that it like they're different, but the harm that's perpetuating them onto us is the same. Like the system or like the monster is the same. And it's segregation that's basically making our experiences the way that it was. So we had like a few Skype calls. We did like a few like community building activities, which is really important, and something that has like come up at the Peer Defense Project a lot. Building trust with community is important, and it should be the first step, right? Like you have to be able to, like the community has to be able to trust you before you do anything else, or else they're not going to do anything. So we built trust between us, and then we had the school exchange where we were able to see our days like class to class and stuff like that. And it was really interesting to me to go to Bronx Letters because it was a smaller school, and my school was like considered the smallest school in Brooklyn. I think like we were a pretty small school. It was a smaller school than me, and it was a predominantly Black and brown student school, and all the students talked to each other. Like walking down the streets, like my buddy was next to me, and she literally would talk to everyone in the hall, and everyone would talk to everyone. Like the students would talk to the teachers after class and stuff, and that was just something that I had never experienced. That was like a level of relationship and comfort and safety that I just never experienced in my school. So for me, like that's why I was like, this needs to change. And that was like the moment that I was like, like actually students deserve the best of both schools. And instead of viewing it from a viewpoint of like what sucks about your school or what makes your school bad, which is the conversation that we often had, it's like, what's the best of our schools that we can put together, and what does like a fully integrated school look like? Because we should all be afforded the best of the best.
Right.
I also just want to name that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
That our lawsuit talks specifically about the importance of teachers of color. And Annette and I met because a Black and Latinx educator at her school, two educators, one Black educator, one Latinx educator, who themselves were very isolated, who had been creating a Black student union, Hispanos Unidos. That's where this work really came from, right? Like it was, I am a former Puerto Rican educator. We had another former Latinx teacher and a current Black educator. And there was the three of us with an ally who was a white educator who supported us to navigate administrative barriers that were put before us. So I just want to name that, this also fell not just on students, but also on educators, specifically educators of color, who I saw Ibrahim's question in the chat, and please correct me if I mispronounce that name, but who were not paid for that work, that additional work that we did. And so in the movement, we're very cognizant of that. We actually at Integrate have a floor of $15 an hour for pay for everyone, and have raised that floor to $16.44 to make sure we're matching a dignified wage in terms of what it means to live in New York. And we've instituted a policy where young people, the only volunteers that are allowed to work in our organization for the coming year will be pro bono attorneys, because we want to acknowledge that if we don't have the funds to pay folks, they cannot say that they're working with us. The only folks who can be unpaid in this kind of work are plaintiffs. And so I appreciate that question very much.
Okay. And Annette, I wanted to go back to the school exchange briefly. So the school exchange idea was to have students from one school go to another school, and then you can see what those other schools are like. And the idea is that then opens up one's eyes to all the possibilities for what a school can be outside of one's own school. Is that right?
Yeah. So a school exchange is basically a group of people exchanging schools and exchanging like a day in my life type of thing. Like you take a buddy with you, you're assigned a buddy from the other school group, and you take each other on your school days. So one day it'll be like I would take my buddy through my school day, and I would take them through my classes and all my like periods of school. And then it would be, we would arrange another day where like my buddy took me to her school or their school and took me through their school day.
Okay, and this was all a project. This was Sarah. This was a project of Integrate NYC, the school exchange project.
Yeah, it was our first project. It was requested by students. Their main request was from Timothy Martinez, who's now actually one of our board members. He's one of our founding youth organizers. He said, "Where are the white schools? Let's go." And because there were no white people in our school besides educators and administrators, no students. And we were arguably what the UCLA says is an apartheid school, over 99% Black and brown, which we can talk about some of the challenges of that language. But I think that Timothy was like, I want to see the white schools. And so we created this school exchange. We called it the 6 train exchange because it was just 3 stops down the 6 train. And then we painted a mural between the 2 schools that in a community garden to like solidify the event. I will say, I strongly suggest an Atlantic piece, which actually criticizes school exchanges. If you're looking to do powerful racial justice work with students, I think the school exchange takes an enormous amount of trauma-informed practice that is very, very difficult to balance. And so I am by no means saying that that is part of our programming. It no longer is. It was initially a pilot done by our students. And I actually would advise against it. I think there are other ways to do youth participatory designed research, because the idea of a day in my life, I mean, you could think about it if you live in a home where you don't have running water, and then you want to go see what it's like to live in a home with water, and you take a hot shower and then you go back to your home. That you may have information and insight, but do you have autonomy, renewed sense of your own power, and a sense of hope and clarity? I don't quite know. You know, we're human beings. And so I would also say that there are many other things that we've done that are powerful. The youth council meetings are really where much of our programming and our organizing began, which was joining students from all around the city at a neutral location, using universal design learning principles of education and bringing expert advocates in to support, develop, and train young people in different skill sets, and then give them the floor to map out the way forward. And that's how the 5R of Real Integration platform was designed, and all the campaigns you see on our website. And that's a similar model that we're using for the Peer Defense Project around supporting young people to get trained in Know Your Rights technology.
Could you say more? You've mentioned it a few times, the 5R approach. Could you say more about the 5R approach? What are the 5 Rs?
Sure, I will. Mark, I saw you jump in for a second.
No, I'd rather hear what you say. I'll come back.
And then we're coming back.
Okay. So the 5 Rs of Real Integration, when Annette and I were working on those school exchanges, essentially the elephant in the room was that when our Black and brown students from predominantly Black and brown schools went to predominantly white schools for a day, they didn't leave saying, wow, that was great, I wish I could go back. That was not the experience at all. In fact, many of them experienced like severe forms of like racialized slurs, microaggressions, that like to your average white and or privileged student or educator may not be that serious. But things, for example, where one of our students entered a classroom and a white educator said, I'm so happy you're here today because maybe you'll teach the other students here to be grateful for the things that they have.
Wow.
So enormously demeaning ways of talking. But as Annette said, those are ways that she was spoken to every day. And so those are ways that she's still spoken to, but are particularly exacerbated in predominantly white institutions, not thinking about culturally responsive education. And so I say all that because the 5 Rs was built out of, so if that's not the model, what's integration? Like if the whole goal isn't so that my baby brother gets into that school and gets told that he's the lesson for the white children to be grateful, then what is the point? And so we started doing an assets-based approach. What do predominantly white schools have that is an asset? and supposed to be protected under discrimination law in New York? What are the assets that predominantly Black and brown schools have that predominantly white schools simply cannot because of the representation of students in the space? And so we started looking at, for example, what did you enjoy about that day? I liked being able to speak to a woman who signed in my name instead of a police officer who frisked me down. That's where the restorative justice program comes from. It was amazing to go into their cafeteria and have food that was edible, delicious, options, the proper temperature, and not see any vermin. Resources, right? And physical buildings. Culturally responsive educators. Well, when I walked in the classroom, all of the teachers were white and all of the curriculum they were teaching was super whitewashed and like really focused on competition. So that's where we talked about how actually in our predominantly Black and brown school in the South Bronx, culturally representative curriculum and culturally representative teachers was actually much stronger. I remember one story where Black students was at our school in the South Bronx and said that a Latinx student had made an anti-Black comment, and a teacher intervened and said, you can't say that in this space for this reason. And the student said he was in shock because in his entire experience as a Black student, a teacher had never intervened and said the words anti-Black ever. And so he said that I want that in our school system. And then, yeah, enrollment, of course, right? How do you get in? And so that's as important as all of the other pieces. But when we're talking about the vantage point, plaintiff-centered work, youth-centered work, actually impacted community-centered work, enrollment is a very small piece of the puzzle. And Mark, I saw you jump.
Well, I was thinking, Sarah, when you said that the teacher said, why don't you speak? In other words, why don't you display yourself? And the white students here will learn how privileged they are, instead of saying there's something really wrong here in terms of what's taking place. And I think in this conversation, part of what movement lawyering I've learned to understand is, as lawyers, we're often taught to view individuals from marginalized communities as deficits, and to treat litigation as dealing with deficit individuals in deficit communities under deficit circumstances, in terms of instead of thinking about individuals that the system itself is the deficit system, and that there is something that is driving that system to be that way. When I was involved in the Detroit case, Detroit has the lowest literacy rate of any major school district in the United States. And it consists of students as smart as any of the students who are listening in today. And one of the things that the government lawyer said in our argument was, the explanation for the fact that the literacy rates are where they are isn't because these young people go to schools without teachers, isn't because they go to schools without books, isn't because they don't have the sort of curriculum that Sarah and Annette are talking about, where they see and learn their histories not in the context of how white individuals treat them, but rather for those communities themselves. But what this lawyer said was, the problem here, and I'm quoting now, is because of the intellectual limitations of these young people and their communities, and because of their families are engaged in, quote, domestic violence. That's a racist system, and that's how a racist system operates. And part of what the 5 R's are about what Integrate NYC, and I know Sarah and Annette, you'd agree, you're not the only organization out there sending this message. Those groups are everywhere, and they are the ones that, along with you, that are championing this system. And part of what is being said here is, listen to us. If you were to create a racist system that had as its objective trying to subordinate individuals and communities, trying to disenfranchise, trying to create competition where one group is always at the bottom. Initially, what you would do is you'd make it a crime to teach Black students. We saw that during a period of slavery. Then you'd see it where the Ku Klux Klan would go out to murder the teachers of these children of color. And now what you have is a public school system with all the sorts of characteristics you're describing. So when students, and we heard this in conversations where where teachers would say to Black students, I want you to put the pros and cons of slavery on the board. I want you to, you must use the N word because it's in this literature. And when Black students would say, I don't want to say that, they say, no, you'd have to do it. Or a teacher in the New York school system who put her foot on a Black student's neck and said, hey, this is how slavery feels. Or saying, I can't really distinguish among Asian students. I don't know how to pronounce your sorts of names. Can we call you something else? Oh, I understand you got into Yale, but you should know you can still go to the jail. Those aren't idiosyncrasies. Those aren't bad apples. Those aren't the exaggerations of a system. They're core to the system itself. And part of what this case is about, and part of all of what this campaign about, is about disgorging that and saying, what does an anti-racist system do? Isn't that really should be the objective of public education? And if it's not, it's because the system is quite content and wants a caste system to continue to operate.
I mean, let me ask you, Mark, what has been the response of the Department of Education in New York and Mayor de Blasio when confronted with some of these facts?
Well, I guess that's the sounds of silence. We haven't heard anything from the government with respect to this case. There are public pronouncements, which we cite in our complaint, where the government has said that we are committed to diversity and we are committed to eliminating racism, but we haven't heard a word. You would expect, first of all, nobody should be filing a lawsuit like this. The 14th Amendment was 1868. Brown, as I said a moment ago, we filed this case literally close to 70 years to the day that the Brown case was filed. We shouldn't have to be filing cases like this in 2021. And one would have hoped that the response would have been, my God, do these conditions exist? We've known about these conditions. We use tests that are that test nothing but affluence and navigational capital. This system is going to change immediately, and we're going to address that. We have heard nothing from the government. What we've heard is from the lawyers for former President Trump, who have said, we want to get in on the other side of this case because we want to maintain the status quo. And your question is so important, Rick, because the test isn't what happens in the courtroom. We're going to win in the courtroom, and we're going to establish this right, which we shouldn't have to be establishing at this point, but we're going to do that. But the question is, for the government officials that you're talking about, which side are you on here? Whose side are you on here? Are you going to say, well, we're doing the best we can, but be patient. These things take time. Or are you going to say, look, if I wouldn't send my kid to these schools and I wouldn't have my kid face curriculum that demean who they are and what their community was about, and I'd want to make sure that my kids saw teachers who look like them, and I want to make sure that my kids are not disproportionately suspended or expelled from schools. That's what we ought to be hearing. And until we hear it, the presumption, the recognition is they're satisfied with these schools precisely like they are, and they're willing to go to court to fight to maintain a system of racism.
Wow. Sarah, how about from your perspective with your organizing work, could you say a bit about the resistance or cooperation that you've encountered from various school officials?
Yeah, so we have not been in conversations with school officials since filing the lawsuit. There have been some public statements about, I think Mayor de Blasio said that the work would continue with or without a lawsuit, which is great. It should continue whatever they're doing and be adjusted to address rights violations with the lawsuit. And so, I think it's important just to back out. And again, like we said, this is one tool. So how are people doing? They're still organizing. they're still fighting racism. They're still dealing with microaggressions. They're still dealing with standardized tests in the middle of a global pandemic. They're still dealing with all of these harrowing inequities. And they've said, this is really exciting. I'm really excited about this. But again, what's super important to acknowledge in this space is this litigation is amazing, but it's also not the most important thing to people who are suffering compounding racism all the time. And so our question and our response has been, so what do you think about this? People are like, that's great. I'm super excited about this. And then our question is to learn more about what's needed, because those needs change and trauma compounds and things get worse as there's less and less action. And so people have been quite supportive. We have had some resistance of folks who believe this is a politicization of education, and who are upset because they believe that some children are in fact gifted and some children are not. I have been, Annette and I have been identified as possibly unqualified to be in spaces that we are in right now. I mean, the real allegations here are the belief that we should never have been able to lead nonprofits ever, or be in law schools, or do any of this work. And so that's not surprising to me when that resistance comes through, because that's why we do the work, is because there's a genuine belief that white and or privileged youth are just more gifted. And that I'm not going to change that mentality. And so we use the court system to be able to enforce a right that exists, and to be able to participate in democracy, and be able to have equal access to public resources. And so for me, it's like I said, people have been really affirming, and also there's so much to learn and so much to do. And in terms of resistance, it's personal attacks, it's organizational attacks, it's political attacks. But for people who fundamentally don't believe in Annette and my potential in the world, who don't believe that women, Latino women, should be leading these efforts, or going to college, or getting into law school, I don't really have much to say to those folks, other than we'll see you in court.
Wow. So I would think, though, I mean, I can't help but think here that this is kind of it's a tragic situation, because you have so many people who would describe themselves as good people. I mean, people who would say, they believe in, I mean, they would say they believe in your potential and the potential of students of all backgrounds and so forth. They would at least say that, right? But they think of themselves as good people, yet somehow they become complicit in this system, which, in one of the richest cities, in one of the richest countries in the world, has such extraordinary inequities. So I guess what I'm wondering now is, how is it that the system seduces people into it in a way? And I can't help but think about Mayor de Blasio, and y'all might have perspectives on that, because I remember before he ran for mayor, I mean, he was the progressive politician who was going to bring about change. He wasn't the status quo oriented, let's justify a bad situation type of guy. He was the voice for change. So what is it that somehow seduces people or makes people become complicit in a system that in fact they should be fighting harder to transform?
So
go ahead, Sarah.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I think that we're human and we are all morally ambiguous in our own ways. But if we're really going to the core of what we're talking about, which is racial caste, and to add more color to that, racialized capitalism as well, I think people are really about holding on to what privilege they have. If you're running for office and you have a political career that you're interested in, and taking a side that is considered radicalized or considered over the top, excessive, and you're concerned about losing support from certain groups, then yeah, you probably won't take it, because it's going to impact your ability to accumulate resources and recognition and wealth. Similarly with parents, I mean, I really urge, I saw a parent in the chat, if you are actively making decisions to ensure that your child is attending a less Black or brown school, you want to ask yourself why, particularly if you identify as a white parent, particularly if you identify as a white and or privileged parent. that is part of the impulse. I think there are plenty of podcasts out there, Nice White Parents and other things like that. But I really think the question is, are you willing to make a decision for the collective over your individual self when it comes to public education? And those are a variety of decisions, whether you're asking for an AP program to be admitted into your school, or whether you're deciding to send your child to your neighborhood district, right? And again, I want to make super clear though as well that the duty and the responsibility of that really falls on the officials with the responsibility, and also really falls on, if we're talking about individual choices, people who are accumulating that power and that privilege from wealth and from racialized privilege. And so those are the things that I think that we all really suffer with. I think it's more compounded with some folks who want to choose individual over collective, but again, there are certain people who need to be held responsible, especially the government officials who are tasked with the responsibility of maintaining that.
You know, if I could add 2 points to what Sarah just said, I think your question, Rick, underscores just how important this case and this campaign are. You know, the Supreme Court said that public schools are the primary vehicle for transmitting the values on which society rests. Now, we all know what the Supreme Court meant by that. They meant democracy, and they meant the opportunity to better your circumstances. But the reality is, the reason that there are nice white parents, the reason that these values and the system itself is tolerated, is because our educational system hasn't done the job it needs to do to talk about how a racist system is created and how it's perpetuated. It has failed in that regard. And so we learn in schools that, you know, if you say the sorts of things that you condemn the use of the N-word, and you condemn the sort of transparent racism of a President Trump, you're doing your part. That's not what it's about. And what we're saying in this case is that the public education system isn't an observer. It isn't a spectator to what's taking place here. It is part of the problem itself, because it is not transmitting how racism is identified in all its aspects, and it's certainly not teaching how to dismantle it. The very fact that this question is raised demonstrates that the public schools are failing and are part of what a race system looks like. And that goes to Sarah's point as well. Look, nobody is seduced in any sort of way unless they, at some level, want to be seduced, unless they want those sorts of justification. There's no innocent victims here in terms of what's taking place. And the fact that the de Blasios have tolerated these systems, have in fact created these systems, and in fact have legitimized these systems by year after year, funding them, supporting them, and refusing to join, refusing to take sides, tells you that they are happy with the system the way it exists, that they don't want the system to so fundamentally change that the balance of power in this country, the access to resources that Sarah was talking about, the basic notion that all children should have access to literacy, that they learn to read so that they can read to learn. The question is, are we all for it? And as long as these schools exist, the answer is nobody's being seduced. Everybody sees this. Our case didn't bring any news headlines to what was happening in these schools. Everybody has known about it, and everyone is complicit in it unless they are aggressively trying to say, we won't tolerate this anymore. I'm not going to send my kid to the most privileged schools. I'm not going to spend thousands of dollars having my kids take test prep to get into those schools. So absolutely everyone has the same access. And that's the only way I want to live on this planet.
Let me ask you, let me ask you then, what are you asking of people of the upper middle class white parent on the upper west side or east side? What is it that you're asking from them? What's the change they need to make in terms of what they do?
So I would like to add to Sarah's point, and I think this kind of answers the question of what would you like them to do. So I think a lot of what people in position to like make other decisions about other, like a group of people or other people forget to do, or they never do at all, is listen to young people. And be in those conversations with communities where young people are present when you are in charge or like accountable for making these decisions for all of these young people, yet you are never in conversation with a student or multiple students, when you never go into the schools and see how the schools are functioning, when you don't invite young people into your space and into your space of decision making as consultants and not just as tokenized members. That's when you make the decisions that don't represent your constituents and that don't align with the young people. So you talked about pushback earlier, and while like pushback for the peer defense project has been different, a lot of the pushback that we have received in the advocacy side, because I've been working with Integrate NYC for 5 years now, has been pushback on not listening to the young people. So we will go into meetings and people will only want to talk to our adult members, right? Because they would only take them seriously, and they wouldn't. And our young people were the people who were living through these experiences day to day and who had the answers for all the questions they had, yet they were not being taken seriously in the spaces that we were stepping into. The DOE would invite us for meetings, and we would go to the meetings, and they would tell us it's not your way, it's this way. But the students were the ones in the systems like living that day to day, right? So when, yeah, I feel like a lot of the times like the movement is slowed down because people in the system and adults will literally just not listen to young people and not believe them on their experiences. And that's literally the space that's the first step. And that's the space that Integrate NYC like holds for young people, and like why we have the network we have, right? Because we make space for students to tell their experiences and believe them. And we base everything off of like what young people are telling us and not the structures that adults are giving us. We see adults more as like allies, and how can their expertise in their field help young people enter the space ready and enter the space as decision makers, so that people will not question the power that they have. Because that, yeah, I think that goes into like ageism and how young people are viewed in spaces, especially like professional spaces.
Okay, great. Let me, we just have a few more minutes here. Before I forget, can you all give the information so that anyone listening can know how to follow Integrate NYC, how to follow this movement, how to track developments with the litigation, with the broader movement? Where should we direct people to keep track of what's going on and to inform themselves? At peerdefense.org.
Yeah, so I just sent that to folks. That is where you can contact Annette and I directly. Okay. Additionally, if you want to see more about the press conference that we did, Public Counsel's Instagram has some really great clips from that. You can visit our website, and you can also follow Integrate NYC at Integrate NYC, which is on Instagram and on Twitter. And really, to what Annette said, ask yourself what's the best role that you can play. Is your best role, from a movement lawyering vantage point, is your best role to support someone else's autonomy with mentorship or sponsorship? Is it to support institutional power by giving up, taking a risk, being brave in your own space to create space for someone who's underrepresented and whose views are underrepresented around healing racialized trauma in education? And then material resources, can you yourself give? Can you yourself help move resources? Really asking yourself to what's the best role you can play, and how can you strengthen your own skill set to better listen to young people? What can you do to better listen to young people, especially BIPOC young people who are negatively impacted by inequities? Acknowledging that if you are not a BIPOC young person, you are missing some insights and some listening skills, and you have some growth to do to be able to fully listen, fully listen and translate that into resources, into autonomy, into institutional power.
Okay, let's, we'll go around just in the last few minutes here. Annette, let me take it back to you. So we have a lot of students who are listening. young people who are in school. Do you have any, words of wisdom, advice, reflection that you'd like to offer them in terms of as they try to think through how they should be involved in issues or how they should even make sense of their own situations?
I would say a lot of the times what you're looking to like be involved in and start, like your community will probably already have something, or like there will be other people in your community who want to start something similar, or something similar has already started. So really see like echoing what Sarah said, like what do you love doing? What are you passionate about? And how can you use that to like support yourself and support your community, and support like the like what you're passionate about and like what you're fighting for. And I think for me, it's just been like being in community, like all of the work that I have like done has been based in my like first in my school community, and then in my Integrate NYC community. I think having it be like community-based work really allows you to honor everyone and respect everyone's input, and sort of see like what are we all fighting for, and we have so a lot of the work that I do is restorative justice, and we have like circles sometimes like when harm has been done, and we also have like community building circles, and those circles where you get to know each other, where you get to know your values, where you get to know like your experiences, are really important to like building the base for whatever work you're trying to do. So I think definitely like being conversations, like hone into that thing you're passionate about that you love doing. Like for me, it was relationships building. In Integrate NYC, I was like the relationships committee lead, and then I was like managing the program for our leads, and then I'm like now at the Peer Defense Project, leading relationship work and like community building work and movement lawyering work within litigation. So yeah, definitely just, I know it's corny, but like follow your heart, and always go back to your community, and think about like what does your community need.
Thank you so much. Now let me take it over to Mark and Sarah. These problems are especially salient in New York City, but they're certainly not confined to New York City. Do you all have thoughts? Sarah, let's start with you about the broader movement or the prospects for a broader movement for racial equity throughout the nation.
Yeah, I mean, to the first thing I would say is educate yourself in movement lawyering. It is not what we are taught in law school. I would argue in law school, there is a real push to accumulate wealth and recognition and status, and whether that's stated or not. And so movement lawyering actively works to dismantle those things. There may not be the fanciest fellowship waiting for you. You may not be able to clerk immediately after school. There are different decisions to make. And so what I would first say is educate yourself in the values of movement lawyering, and think about the things you're pursuing that may be disrupting that path, if it is in fact something you want to practice. I would also say to really find folks who have done this work. Having a mentor like Mark is really incredible. Looking at the work of the incredible women of color and attorneys at the Movement Law Lab, and the movement lawyering work that's been done there is incredible. And so educate yourself deeply in that work. And then, like Annette said, build relationships with people. This does not work on a timeline of a fellowship application. You cannot just decide the spring before your 3L year that you want to support a movement. You have to think really deeply about this work and build for a long period of time. And so I think it's really about what are you doing and how are you serving movements that people trust you, because there's enormous distrust with attorneys. And so I think the second piece is educate yourself in movement lawyering, and then put in the time and the energy to build trust. And then the last piece I would say is find all the expertise and all the resources and all the networks you can from legal spaces, and funnel them to those movements. And so I think those are the three real steps that I would suggest. Also, we're going to be building a national training hub. And so in 2022, there will be a national training hub in which we will support other folks to be trained in our model. But again, it's just a model. And I don't ask anyone to use the nonprofit industrial complex to operationalize movements, but we will have a training for folks to be able to support and share that information. But otherwise, again, learn about movement lawyering, meet the people doing the work, spend months, years building those relationships, and then just share those resources.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So Mark, we're at our end time, so you can close it out. Prospects beyond New York City. Do you have a forecast, prediction, a hope?
I have an expectation. I mean, you could throw a dart at a map of this country and hit a community that raises all the same issues that we're talking about. Look, lawyers don't win cases. Stories win cases. Individuals win cases. I think what all the three of us are saying is that these stories need to be out there. As brilliant as the lawyers were in Brown, it was the stories of segregation and the contradictions that led to that victory. We all need to be listening for the stories. We all need to be encouraging these stories. I mean, right now we have COVID going on, and there are young people in the communities that we're talking about all over the country that are suffering because there is a lack of concern that they get the educational opportunities. Those stories are out there, and it's all our responsibility to make sure that they're heard. And that brings me to my last point. I sometimes think when I have these conversations, sometimes people come up to me and they say, you know, Mark, it's great what you're doing. Thank you for giving back. And I know they mean well, and I appreciate the comments, but I want to be really clear. I'm not giving back anything. I am gaining. There's nothing involving sacrifice of anything meaningful compared to what we get from the opportunity to partner with individuals like Annette and Sarah and the folks that they're working with. There's no better way to live a life than to be part of it. And speaking as a parent, the schools that I want my kids to go to are not the schools where my kids have to take expensive test prep in order to get in, Stanford aside. They are the schools where young people like this are present, and where my kids can learn to be honest about who they are and to find out who others are and to live a life that reflects those sorts of values. There isn't an ounce of sacrifice in this. It's all about getting what is the most important, most meaningful opportunities in life. And every law student and every policy student has nothing to lose and everything to gain by being part of what this is all about.
We could not end on a better point than that. So thank you all for allowing us to share in this inspiring partnership. I look forward to institutionally, being able to support your efforts and am inspired by all that you've done so far. So thank you, Annette, Sarah, and Mark. Till we reconvene. That is the end of Tuesday Race Talks for today. Everyone stay safe.